fund NYBDC. And I use the term alternate lender because largely to describe the fact that we're not subject to, you know, the same regulatory limitations that a federal or state chartered bank would be. For instance, a federal or state chartered bank would be criticized, as I said earlier, by its regulators if they made a loan based on projections. And much of what we're dealing in the MWB space is projection-based loans, particularly, you know, contract-based loans. So, you know, that's why they capitalize us. There's no reason. I don't agree with you that you need to have a set aside. All right, there has to be adequate funds to make sure that all eligible loans are funded. That is the bigger question for me. And you ask me, do I have enough money? Yes, I have enough money. What I don't have is enough eligible loans to fund. And that gets to your question of creditworthiness. How do lenders define creditworthiness? Everyone who decides to give someone else money has a decision. Am I loaning it or am I gifting it? All right? If I gift it, then it's irrelevant whether somebody can pay it back. If I loan it, I have to know how they loan it, whether it's a loan made from a grandmother or the, you know, some great bank in the United States. How is that loan going to be repaid? And that's the challenge. That's the real challenge of banking when you're dealing with startup and early stage businesses. You have to look at management experience, you have to look at their business plan, their competition in the market, the likelihood of their success, the opportunities that they have, the other people who are seeking those opportunities, and whatever other indicia you can get from their past life that impacts that. And I will tell you, one of the factors that we do not consider in our organization is collateral. If collateral is available, we will take it. If it is not available, we will not decline the loan based on the collateral. Our specific policy says no loan shall be declined based solely on the absence of collateral. We understand that. We understand that many of these businesses, small businesses that we serve, are service businesses. They will never accumulate much in the way of collateral other than perhaps accounts receivable, God willing, right? They're not the type of business where you want to see intensive activity in terms of collateral. So the core decision for us, and it gets back to your question of what's creditworthy. The creditworthy decision for us, you know, Bank A may say creditworthy to us means historic cash flow at 1.25 times coverage of debt service. That's what they may say. And the regulator may come in and say, you know what, that's not good enough. You have to have 1.4 times cash flow, or you have to have this much clout. For us, it is simply a decision. We look at this thing, say, can we look into this plan? And based on the information we have available, can we project that this business will be able to pay its debts as and when agreed through the revenue generated through normal operations? If you think it's difficult to say no to someone for a loan, multiply that times 1,000 and watch them lock the door for the last time. Watch them invest every bit of their life, every bit of their savings into a business and walk away from it without being able to do anything except get a job. That responsibility bears heavily on us when we make these decisions. So we make decisions based on projections, and we want the businesses to succeed. The type of assistance that you indicate, satellite offices, we don't have satellite offices. We have zip cars in Manhattan. We pick up a car a block from our office, and we are in the York College, we're in Greater Jamaica, we're at UMass, we're up at Carver, we're all over the city, we're all over the state, all right? I put an average of 40,000 miles a year on my car because I am all over the state. We're in Buffalo, we're in Long Island, we're in everywhere you want to go. As I said, if you have a stage, we'll speak on it. But the reality is spending time with these individual businesses, providing the technical assistance. Our Excelsior Growth Fund, which I mentioned, does our online program. We were able to get over $2 million in grants to support exactly what you advocate, business advisory services. If a business comes to us and they need help putting their financial statements together, you know, I admit SBDCs are great, SBSs are good, but they have limitations. They have a limitation of the amount of time they can spend with a customer. We have the ability to put that customer in touch with a financial advisor, a web designer, a marketing person, whatever their needs are. We have a list of professionals that we can assign to that business. They're willing to spend the time with us. Buffalo Boss is a great example. They've got a great business model, but they need help with their financial presentation. So we work closely with them, and they've acknowledged that in various public releases, which is why I'm allowed to talk about it. But we sat down and rolled up their sleeves with our advisors and these kind of things. Those kind of services are out there. Now, for instance, in terms of connections, boy, wouldn't I like to see Empire State Development have a page on your next resource guide that talks about the Bridge to Success program, rather than relying on someone at ESD, for instance, because there are any number of people at ESD who may not know about the Bridge to Success program or made that referral. So I think granular type of interaction, granular type of referrals to available programs, and demand the level of service. Making sure that your constituents, MWBs, come in and demand a level of attention and service. If you're not going to approve the loan, tell me why. You have that right to know. What can I do to make my application more effective, more persuasive, more likely of approval in the future? They all have that right, and we accept that and embrace that as we do that. Now, I want to scale with the alternate lending space, because I'm not sure what you think would be a good interest rate, but our average interest rates are about between 4.5% and 6%. We often disconnect loan terms, so we'll often give a business a 10-year term with a 20 or 25-year amortization. Now, that being said, on our online program, the rates are higher, but those decisions are made instantly, and there's a price that we pay for that, for the lack of underwriting, for the lack of intent of underwriting. But we're normally underwriting a loan. Our interest rate is going to be between 4.5% and 6%. The term of the loan is going to be, 5 to 7, 10, 15 years. And it's going to be, it's not going to be collateral dependent. If there's collateral available, we'll take it. If there's not available, we're not going to say no.
And the alternate,
That's alternate. That's
alternate. Oh, okay.
Yeah, we're an alternate. We're simply an alternate because we're not a bank.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
We are essentially the bank. The bank has funded us to address things that they can't address.
And how many MWBEs? The number of companies give these loans? Yeah.
How many? I'm sorry.
The count of companies who got the loans.
I can't tell you how many active accounts we have right now. Honestly, I can tell you that it's a percentage of our portfolio.
That's a big.
Sorry.
We need the hard number.
I'm sorry.
No, I said we need the hard number. So
Okay.
so we could just reference.
Sure.
Overall, like how many?
I don't have the hard number.
Hard number. Okay.
30% of our portfolio, which would be I can extrapolate. We have about 2,300 borrowers, so 30% of our portfolio would be somewhere between 700 and 800 loans.
I'm sorry?
We have about 2,100 borrowers, active borrowers at the present time. So 30% of that would be about somewhere between 700 and 800 businesses that would be MWBE. I mean, that's just extrapolating from that number.
That's just extrapolating, right? It could be 10 borrowers or 10 big
It could be what?
It could be 10 big companies that make up that 30%.
No, I'm saying we have over 2,100.
No, I know, I'm just saying.
It could be, but it's not.
There's a limit
It
on
could
the
be
size.
anything, but it's not. It's not as you say.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would love to visit with you.
Yeah.
If
let's
I could.
do that. Let's sit down and
Absolutely.
do the numbers.
Thank you. And you will definitely be visiting with me. First of all, thank you for your patience and
No, my pleasure.
your testimony and answering, the questions that have been presented. So I have a couple that, just occurred to me as I listened to some of the other commenters. I think probably one of the most surprising thing to me is because as we all hear from MWBEs in our communities that they don't know about these programs, and I think that is a very big problem, making sure that people find out that there is access to capital for them. But it seems though as if, and this is not personally at you, I'm just like thinking out loud here. It seems as if we almost give more opportunity to startups, because in your own testimony you said more than 20% of your loans go to startups with no historic revenue in early stage, less than 2 years operations. So it's just odd that you have that group of people who have no historic revenue, have almost no experience whatsoever, and 20% of the loans are going to them. But then when you finally do get, some historic revenue and you get yourself up and operating, those are the small minority women-owned business organizations that wind up in trouble later on because particularly, I'm going to go back to the hearing we did last week on the construction industry and prompt payment. Many of them, these small MWBE contractors may have started, gotten a loan, you know, when they had no historic revenue projections and no way to prove that they were credit worthy or the ability to repay it. And now they're out there and they're operating and they're working under a GC as a subcontractor on a state-run program or a city-run program, and because of change work orders or whatever the issues are, they get stuck at the bottom and they have no access to capital now. Now they can't meet their own payroll. They can't show credit worthiness anymore. And even if they were to turn around and go to the state's new Excelsior program, they wouldn't qualify there either, because you won't show 2 years of $120,000 of revenue. And so we're almost giving them a boost out the door and then slamming it in their face. And again, this is not directed at you. It just seems that these programs don't work in the right direction. So the money may be there. The capital might be available if people knew about it, but once we kind of put people on the path, we create additional stumbling blocks along the way that almost hurt them and make them less likely to be eligible for an additional loan program. That's more of an observation than it is.
Yeah, and
I'm just curious as to you see these programs.
I don't see that, because what happens is that, you know, for instance, let me use Shep at A&M Electric and Circuits. You know, great electrical contractor. I don't know. He's pretty spoke. You may have testified at one of more hearings, because he's pretty vocal about the whole space.
Well, we had the electrical contractors up.
Yeah, and so we've been loaning money to Shep for about 10 years at various stages. Now under the Bridge to Success program. So while 20% of our loans, maybe the early stage, are startups, when they pass that stage, it doesn't mean that they, you know, that we kick them out of the nest, because we don't. They then just morph into businesses that would be, by definition, considered to be no longer early stage or startup. And that doesn't mean they don't have access to all the resources. We've had many borrowers of ours we've had, you know, 10, 15, 20 years that they've been with us under a series of different loans under the Bridge to Success. For instance, we have 3 borrowers that have 5 separate contracts that they've borrowed money for us to loan it. So, you know, that phenomena could be there, but I do sometimes, I have to say, in our own internal credit committee, I say to someone with a turnaround story, for instance, someone comes in and reports the financial circumstances that you report, and I say to myself, and I say to our committee, I said, would we approve this loan to this business as a startup without this negative stuff? Do we understand why it got here? Do we understand that this job was poorly handled from an owner point of view? Do we understand that there were perhaps unanticipated challenges to the business by the payment stream or the lack of payment stream on the contract? Do we understand that? Can we get over it? Are we comfortable with management? Do we understand it? Was the situation that caused this problem, was it identifiable, curable? You know, we had a situation, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, where every bakery that we had went belly up, basically, in terms of financial. And why did that happen, right? Because flour prices jumped 10 times in the space of about 2 months, right? And a lot of these businesses were on contracts where they delivered X number of loaves of bread and X number of this, and most of them were in the metropolitan area, and they were hammered, truly. But with those businesses, we went and met with them when we understood that it was like a meteor dropping out of the skies. And that if you deal with that in the future by hedging your obligations and making your contracts tied to flour prices, and a lot in the industry was learned by that. So yeah, I can't say that doesn't happen, Senator, but I can tell you categorically it doesn't happen with us. And the charge that we have from the New York banks that are our members, the 118 member banks that we have, and is that we make sure that doesn't happen to our borrowers, and that we serve those borrowers as their surrogate.
So that brings me kind of another interesting question. So the funding that you have, essentially, the majority of it comes from banks. They fund your organization so that you can do the lending that they are unwilling or not unwilling or risk averse to doing themselves. So who assumes then the risk on this? Is it the New York State Bank? Is it your organization?
Well, we borrow this money. We get no grant money whatsoever. We borrow money from the banks, and we pay it back. Now, what happens is the banks lend it to us. I mean, obviously, any lending organization, you have to provision for loss. You have to make sure that you charge an interest rate that would be, at least keep you at break even. So what happens is, in order to address that, when we have a riskier profile for our borrower and a higher rate of loss in some cases than the banks might expect, they provide us the money at how we're able to loan out. How are we able to make a loan to a startup at 6%, right? With the risk and loss embedded in that, is because we're able to borrow from the banks at very low rates. The banks make concession to us in terms of rate, and our goal is that we try to get a spread of 2% on the loans to cover overhead, loss provisioning and things like that. And our goal is to keep the rate as low as possible, and they allow us to do that by lending us the money at certain rates.
Do they ever allow you the ability to grant the money as opposed to lend it? Because in the Hurricane Sandy situation, that was a particular problem in my district, Senator Sanders' district. I'm not sure if it affected your part of the area, but one of the challenges for Sandy-owned businesses, many of them were minority and women-owned businesses, was they were already dealing with debt that they were carrying just from the day-to-day operation. And when Sandy washed away their business, it didn't wash away their debt, right? So they still had the debt, and they had lost inventory, and they had lost business. They were shuttered for quite a while, but many of them, as you know, are not owners of the properties that their businesses were operating out of, and they were put in a position where now they still have all their existing debt that goes to that business that was there the day before Sandy came along, and now they have the added burden of capital improvements of the properties that their businesses are housed in, but that they don't own. So many of them were unwilling, because I know in part of your testimony you talked about small businesses not coming forward to apply so that the MWBEs aren't getting the lending because they're not applying for the lending, but many of them made a decision that it wasn't worth it because they couldn't afford an additional debt, and they also did not want to invest in someone else's property, not knowing whether or not that landlord was going to allow them to stay there. So a situation like that, we created a program that really doesn't necessarily fit, where a grant would have been far better for those business owners. It would have gotten them up on their feet much faster, and the risk to them would have been less, and in the long run, I think it would have been better for the program as well. Is there ever a possibility where you're able to just make that decision that a grant is a better idea, taking into consideration these kind of situations?
We're a private company, so the magnitude of our ability to administer a grant program would be a challenge for us. I mean, it's not what we do. We don't do investment banking. We don't do these things. But we did. I will say that 3 days following Sandy, we met in Red Hook on a boat called the Cape Race, which is appeared at Red Hook, with city and state officials, representatives of the New York Bankers Association, and we met there because it was the only place that we could have power on a boat with its own generator. So we sat there and we fashioned the Bankers Association response, and within 7 days, banks kicked in over $18 million to support the Sandy Small Business Recovery Fund. Now, it wasn't the big banks in New York. It was banks like Pathfinder Bank out of Oswego, New York, First Niagara out of Buffalo, banks across New York State who came to that. And they basically trusted us, and I will tell you, not a single one of them expected to get it back. So in their view, it was a loan. And we made credit decisions, and we dispersed the money at a speed that I will tell you no state or local government has even approached since that time, with very minimal credit. All we had to do was make sure you had your last tax return filed, you had a 625 credit score, and you got the money at 1% interest.
Do you have any idea how many of those loans were defaulted on?
I know exactly how many of those loans were defaulted on, and it has been informing our thinking about lending over the last 2 years, and it largely informed our online process. Of the $18 or so million in loans that we made, we have total credit losses under $120,000. Exactly. My reaction, exactly.
But where, many of these
And I don't-
businesses are gone, so what
And
what do they do?
I don't underestimate, there's a factor involved in that is not present in any other lending decision. These were New Yorkers who appreciate someone coming to their aid. These were relatively, these were $25,000 loans, first of all, so I want to put that in perspective. These weren't the loans that the SBA was doing and the SBA requiring multiple levels of collateral and all sorts of other things. These were loans that were businesses that were viable, that were going to restart. We've had some that didn't restart, but they went into other businesses or other areas and they maintained, they asked for an amortization, they asked for an abatement, they asked for a period of time, and they performed actually very well. And which is, we're using that information to inform our lending practices and how do we expand the credit box? How did that allow us to expand the credit box? And we have consistently expanded it based on that information. But I don't know. I hope I was responsive to your question.
No, I'm glad to hear that the default rate was low, but, because I can tell you, many of the businesses have simply, they've gone out of business, they've disappeared since then, particularly along, like, the industrial North Shore of Staten Island. The East Shore didn't have as many commercial businesses, it was predominantly residential, but in Coney Island, we still see the same thing. Our commercial strip is still devastated. Neptune Avenue, we have a bank, in fact, that left. Chase Manhattan left.
I'm very,
So,
I am familiar with that. It's sort of outside of our ken
Right.
to do the grant side of this. But what, the grant in terms of our time, energy, and effort, and we administer these programs essentially just administer them. There was no revenue to us for this. Our grant side of this was donating, tens of thousands of hours of staff time to run a program that, was making its first loan advance 7 days after Sandy.
right, I just have a couple of more questions. The average length of a loan is how long?
I would say the average length, we don't make loans any shorter than 5 years.
Okay,
That's
so-
about the shortest we'll make, and we'll make them out to 20 years,
So, because I know there's a concern about, and there should be, about not alternative lending but the other places where people can access money for the short term, because some people may not want to take on a 5-year loan. Maybe they only need a short-term loan to get them. And so, of course, none of us own the internet. We all know the problems that we face there with people going online to borrow money from less scrupulous lenders. Is there ever an idea about maybe making a smaller, a shorter term loan? Because, again, you may only need to get through, your next contract coming in.
Yeah,
You don't need to carry a 5-year note on that, maybe, but it doesn't. So, again, if we know that there are programs that are available that people don't seem to know about, that's a problem, right? We need to make sure that we do our part to see to it that MWBEs and all around the state are aware that there are these programs. That's number one. Number two, though, they're operating right now when they're turning to less scrupulous lending sources, and they may, even if they did find out about some of your programs, they may say, well, I don't want to carry that debt for 5 years. I only need a short-term 1-year loan. So is there any thought into creating an alternative lending model?
Well, we approach it the same problem from a different direction. Right? So, and I agree with you about the online lending space. It is potentially the most devastating. There was an article today in the Journal, articles in American. There's articles almost every day on the predatory nature of that space. And I was here probably 3 or 4 weeks ago and testified to the Assembly Committee on Banks. It was a joint committee hearing on three assembly committees. I testified on the online space because it's an area in which I have particular involvement. But the thing, I approach your issue from another way. So we have many businesses come in and say, well, I don't want a 5-year loan. I can pay this back in a year. We said that's fine. But in the meantime, how do we structure that loan? Do we structure that loan as 12 equal payments over a space of a year, which are high and impede cash flow? Or do we structure it differently and we say, okay, fine, we're going to give you a 5-year loan. You think you can pay it back in 2 years? That's great. We're going to give you a 5-year loan so your monthly payments will be smaller. But anytime you want to come in with the checkbook and pay it off, there's no penalty, there's no interest, there's no we don't require that they owe us the money for 5. Unlike the online space, I compare the online space to our space. In the online space, you buy the money, right? You bought it. And you can't pay, if you pay it back faster, it doesn't matter. You bought it, you paid 30 grand for 100, you're gonna pay 30 grand for 100. In our space, you rent the money. You only pay for it interest-wise as long as you have it. So we approach that differently. We think many businesses think, oh, I can pay it off in a year. But a year will constrain your cash flow. Why do you put yourself in that box? What happens when that state contract doesn't pay like you think it's gonna pay and you need some breathing room? So we acknowledge that, and we approach it very differently. We say, you can pay this off anytime you want, and it's not gonna cost you a penny more. You pay 6%, you're gonna pay 6% till the day your check clears, and then that's it. As I said, the online space, you're buying the money. With us, you're renting it.
Mm-hmm. And my final question, in your experience, do you find that one of the biggest impediments to actually accessing the capital is that the inexperience of the business operation itself? They don't, I know you referenced something about reported revenue versus actual revenue. Is it, you know, is there some sort of assistance that can be provided to many of these MWBEs, which are small startups, so that they can better prepare themselves, so they're able to be able to apply and be approved and not run into problems? Is there almost like grant writing? Yes.
You know, I'll be brutally candid. I mean, the problem that we have is, and we've all faced this in our life, we can pay one price for a cash deal, or we can pay another price for a credit card or a check. Every time that happens, every single time that happens, that business has ring-fenced itself out of getting credit for that revenue for purposes of a lending decision.
That's a term I've never heard, ring fencing. Explain it to me.
You're excluding it. You're putting you're carving it out of the whole. So if you can't report it on your tax return, you've carved it out of the whole, and it can't be considered by a lender. If I go in and verify your tax return, your revenue, I can look at your lifestyle, I can look at what you own, look at what your credit score is, look at your bank account, and sort of figure out you're doing really well. But if I look at your tax return for your business and I see no visible means of support, I have a problem. I can't lend on what I think you make. I can only lend on what you actually report.
But you do that for startups.
Exactly, because that would be zero, and that's easy to verify, right? We're doing projections, but if you want to know how you would help MWBs in a comprehensive way, tax advice, guidance, and consulting. So many of the people who don't report revenue believe that if I report it, I'm going to have to pay tax on it. They lose sight of the deduction side of the equation. They focus on not paying tax on the revenue, where a properly constructed tax return may in fact result in no tax revenue or no tax impact for them. So training can allow them to feel comfortable in exposing all of their revenue to the lender so that we can make that decision. So that's a key issue. I think exposure, making the connections, I mean, that's a key issue. But I think the two other ways is that celebrate the successes and make people account for their decisions in the lending space. If you're an alternate lender and you claim to be serving a population or a community or a program, you know, turn your cards over. Show us what, provide data and information about what you're doing. And I think those are important aspects of accountability that we all should be facing in this space.
Thank you. And Senator Sanders had one follow-up question.
Yes, thank you.
He's writing notes.
Yes, no, I'm good at writing notes. Two observations and a follow-up question. I'm noticing that you're able to lend to companies for a period of years, many years, and of course, it just reflects that, in theory, we want these companies to grow themselves out. And the question, of course, not for you, but for all of us, why aren't these companies able to grow? What glass ceiling are they hitting that means that they're still going to you 10, 15, 20 years down the line? Just an observation. Another observation, of course, when you're speaking of when people don't have revenue, but of course you guys are still looking at their assets that they may not have revenue, but they certainly have assets that you're looking at. I'm trying to find some way to look at that in some new lights. But to the issue that the chair had raised of why isn't the BDC considering grants. It seems to me that the banks, the larger banks, should see BDC as a opportunity to use for CRA. And they should be looking at that as a way of doing it. And if you are having trouble finding if you don't feel that you are best suited for that, can I suggest that we find an intermediary? I'd be delighted to work with you to find one if you believe that that's the difficulty.
I'm not, the answer is of course yes. I'd be delighted to work with you in any way that advances expanding opportunity and access to capital. But when we talk about businesses, grants, it's hard to justify a grant to a private citizen with our charter. I mean, that's not something we would do. The banks are sort of well tuned at that. I mean, we do. I don't want to say we don't make grants. Last year, I think we granted out over $3 million to various organizations and entities. I think we supported about 250 different entities in the state of New York with grants or gifts, all designed to do a simple thing, enhance the lifestyle of New Yorkers who are in need. You know, and those were grants to things like, you know, the Arthur Ashe Foundation, the Ithaca Public School Project, Red Hook Initiative, $100,000 to enable and empower entities and communities to have those kind of impacts. But that's really on a very small scale, to be honest with you, and it's not generated at, you know, taking a person with potential, essentially is what you're talking about, a person or a business with potential, and providing them with a you know, basically a balance sheet item. But that ignores the fact that if you give $100,000 to a private citizen, right, $45,000 with it is going to go to pay the tax on it in New York State. All right? So I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best way to go in terms of the way those grant dollars, because even though the grant is coming from an entity, it's still taxable income to the business. So what we try to do is support them with flexible and, quite frankly, when I talk about the loan terms that we provide to startups and early stage businesses and associations I'm involved with across the country, people look at me like I have 6 heads. You know, that, you know, 5 and 4, 4 and 5 and 6% to a startup industry is good. But we are, in essence, granted. When we are given loans from the state of New York, or we get loans from, not the state of New York, when we get loans from the banks in New York, those loans are at very low interest rates to allow us to take the kind of risks that we take. And I think that's how they approach that issue. And I think that's what our charter is. The kinds of things that you're talking about, which I understand, are outside of what we do best, and we try to stick to our knitting as best we can, to be perfectly honest with you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We will sit down, sir.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
And we definitely will be reaching out to you to come into Staten Island and South Brooklyn, especially the Coney Island area, to talk about how we can do a better job of making sure our MWBEs are aware of the programs that might be beneficial to them, and continue working on how we think we can make them better for everybody. We want to thank you for your testimony. You've been very patient, and we look forward to continuing this hearing. We are now going to move on to our next panel. Ms. O'Neill? Thank you, Patty.
Thank you very much.
These are 3 MWBE business owners. Mr. Ron Gardner, who is the founder and CEO of Gardner Business Services. He's the head of the Albany chapter of the Association of Minority Enterprises of New York. Mr. Frank Garcia, who is the founder and CEO of Millennium Toner Incorporated, chairman of the National Association of Latino State Chambers. And Ms. Gloria, I want to make sure I say your name correctly, Lovesi,